Growing up in Pennsylvania, I've ridden on pretty much every type of terrain, from slick clay to rocky strip mine trails. But I had never ridden in deep sand before, and let's just say it exposed some serious weaknesses in my riding. I thought I knew how to handle the dirt bike, but this was a whole different challenge. I got the chance to ride in deep Florida sand for the first time, and it forced me to completely rethink how I control the bike. My throttle control, body positioning, and even my suspension setup. It all had to change. But here's what surprised me the most. The skills I picked up after just 2 days in the sand might actually make me a better rider everywhere. Today, I'll break down exactly what I learned, the biggest adjustments I had to make, and how this experience is going to level up my riding for good. But before we get into all that, I'm trying to reach 5,000 subs. It's free, and it really helps me out. So hit that button below and join the Supermoto crew today. Thanks for all your support. Now back to the video. If you follow my channel, you know that I've been riding the CRF 250F for pretty much the entire past year. For this trip, I decided to take my YZ125 down to Florida. I left the CRF 250F at home and I got on the two-stroke motocross bike. And in deep sand, this was a massive adjustment. Riding the 125 required me to be in the perfect RPM range and carry momentum, which is something that I really haven't had to think about as much on the 250F all year long, because that bike's an air-cooled 4-stroke trail bike. It has really tame power delivery. It's pretty consistent the whole way across the RPM range. And I wasn't really riding in this sandy sort of conditions. So switching to the 125, where even on regular terrain, you have to keep it in a perfect RPM range, always carry your momentum, that sort of thing. Then you add sand into the mix. It was immediately very noticeable. I suspect the CRF 250F would have felt more planted, but also heavier and harder to maneuver, probably a lot laggier since it was heavy, not as powerful of an engine, especially in the sand. I ended up taking the motocross bike because I was going to ride on the motocross track, and I do plan on racing the YZ125 this year, so I wanted to get some seat time on that bike. The motocross track that I went to, Waldo MX, and I just made a video last week reviewing Waldo MX, so if you want to see my full breakdown of this track, check out my review video. We showed up, I unloaded the 125, and first off, I hit the motocross track. I had just got my suspension done, and I set the sag. I went out with the clickers in pretty much a neutral position. It was my first session out, and keep in mind, I've been riding woods for pretty much the entire year last year on the CRF 250F. This is pretty much my first time back on a motocross track. This was all just kind of about fact finding. I go out on the 125, my bike was bucking like crazy, especially in the braking bumps, which was kind of surprising to me how fast those form in the sand. Because it's softer, when you get just a few bikes on it hitting the same line over and over again, it really forms up into really choppy and rough braking bumps pretty quickly. So like I said, my bike was bucking all over like crazy, bouncing all around. It made it feel really unsettled and unstable. After a couple laps, I took the bike back to the truck. I actually asked ChatGPT about suspension because I don't know the first thing about suspension clickers. I've never really tried to learn about it. So I was like, all right, ChatGPT, here's exactly what's happening and what do I do about it? And it suggested turning the compression and rebound clickers clockwise 2 clicks, which will slow down how quickly the suspension compresses and rebounds. So it's supposed to keep the bike more stable over the bumps. So I did this just on the shock at first. I went out for another session and the rear of my bike felt way more compliant, going right over the bumps, but the front end was still bouncing around. So when I charged hard into turns, it kind of felt like my bars were bouncing up and down, very choppy still. And it just made it feel like the bike wasn't really super compliant in the front, kind of unstable when I was going into turns, choppy all over the place. So I went back to the truck, asked ChatGPT again. It said, do the same thing to the front fork. So I went 2 clicks clockwise on the rebound and compression on both the front forks and went out for another session on the track. Huge improvement. Honestly, it blew me away how just 2 clicks on the suspension clickers make such a massive difference. Like I said, I never messed around with this at all before. I never really knew what was going on or why it did what it did, but immediately this was a huge improvement. The bike felt so much more balanced and stable. Like I said, the rear end felt more compliant, the front end felt more compliant. As I was charging into corners, I felt super stable. The bike wasn't unsettled by the time I got into the ruts. I was ready to hit the rut, go around the corner. It was great. So my dad was there, he was watching me ride, and he ended up pointing out to me that I wasn't leaning forward enough. And I knew that I was doing this because my arms were pumping up like crazy. I could tell, but like I said, I've been riding in the woods and my body positioning was kind of developing bad habits, not necessarily from riding in the woods. I don't know what it was, but I've been developing sort of a bad habit of not really leaning out over the front of the bike very much. I felt myself sitting down a lot too. And when I'd give it gas on the bike, it felt like I was just getting like pulled back because I wasn't really in the right body position. And I wasn't really feeling stable in a lot of the turns either, I think because I was sitting down. My goal was to fix this. So what I did was I was really tired after all that arm pump. So I decided to go and hit the woods loop. And this ended up posing completely different challenges. The whole time I was making sure that I was in the proper attack position. I was trying to put my chest to the handlebars, and that would make sure that my head was out over the front of the bike. I was trying to stand up the whole way through, and I was trying to keep my butt up in that really good attack position. That's what I was focusing on the whole time I was riding the woods loop. But like I said, the woods loop had some completely different challenges. It was also deep sand. The MX track had choppy, close together braking bumps. They were rough, but they were manageable, especially with the suspension adjustments that I made. The woods loop had super deep, like 2 to 3 foot deep, spaced out sand rollers. They weren't like braking bumps, they were more like rollers. And when I was going across them, I would drop down into them, and it was like I was riding a boat. The suspension felt really like bouncy. I would come out of a big braking bump and then my bike would just be super unsettled. It just felt like I was like on a really big like springy pogo stick. I also asked ChatGPT about this because I was kind of confused. I always thought wood suspension would be softer than motocross suspension. And when I asked ChatGPT about this, it's actually the opposite. Wood suspension is supposed to be a little bit stiffer. And the reason is that wood suspension needs to absorb those big and fast impacts from like roots, logs, those big rollers, that sort of thing. And the wood suspension setup is actually closer to a supercross setup than a motocross setup, which I thought was really interesting. I didn't get to adjust my suspension for woods this time, but I'm excited to test it out when I go back home now that I sort of know a little bit more about what's happening. Like I said, I was practicing the attack position in the woods, leaning forward more out over the bike, standing up all over the place, and trying to just carry momentum and speed through the woods in the sand. I think this really helped me carry that form back onto the MX track. It helped me sort of solidify the proper body position. So I ended up riding at Waldo on Friday. Then I went to Daytona Supercross on Saturday. Then I went back to Waldo on Sunday. I did a warm up in the woods again. Tried to do the same thing, focus on my attack position, leaning out over the front of the bike the whole time. Did a few laps on that. Then I hit the MX track, and immediately I felt way more confident. Less arm pump, better control, and I was able to push way harder into the turns. I had my dad watching me too, and I said, hey, am I like out over the front of the bike? He was filming me a little more, and he said, yeah, you're looking like you're in a way better body position, more out over the front of the bike. And I'm telling you, it didn't feel like I was hanging on for dear life. I wasn't getting all pumped up. Really, it just felt great once I sort of cracked that code. And combined with the fact that on the 125, what I've been learning, and sand makes this super, super apparent, you have to drop a gear from what you normally would be in and always basically either have it full throttle or no throttle. You're either on the gas or you're braking. You better keep it in that power band, keep it in that optimal RPM range. You're trying to blow that bike up. You're holding it wide open, and I tend to lug the bike. And I think I ride 4 strokes a lot better than I ride 2 strokes, so I'm trying to learn how to ride a 125 properly. But the sand made it really apparent. And I think all these techniques that I've basically had to learn to ride properly on the sand track, I think I'm gonna take that with me, and it will help me way more when I go back to Pennsylvania and other tracks, being in the proper gear, being in the proper RPM range, having the proper body position, because the sand basically just completely exposed these like bad habits. If I keep that in my mind, it's really going to solidify that and help me ride properly when I go back. The other thing is the tire choice. I ended up running the Dunlop MX-34. I thought about getting the MX-14 scoop tire since I was going to be riding sand, but I was only going to be riding sand for like 2 days, so I figured the MX-34 will perform better in PA on the motocross tracks here, but it worked great in the Florida sand too. I really didn't have any real traction issues, so I think it was still a solid choice. If you don't ride sand all the time, I probably wouldn't go for the scoop tire, but that being said, I've never ridden the scoop tire, so I really don't know how exactly that works. I'd really like to try it out at some point, but I just didn't feel that it was worth it for me for only 2 days of riding. The MX-34 ended up working just fine. So with all that being said, if you're still struggling to improve, even after watching videos like this, maybe you're thinking about speed the wrong way. Too many riders focus on going faster when they should be focused on being smoother. In fact, that's exactly what this video here is about. Why you shouldn't try to be a faster rider and what you should do instead. Check it out.